That's what evidence-based healthcare is. It's trying to figure out who and under what circumstances do our evidence-based treatments work for? What are the risks and what are the benefits? And it's trying to figure out, how do we tailor approaches? We're not good at that. That's where the science is behind, like you said. But the wellness approach is to pitch it for everyone, and that's what I'm trying to caution against.
Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. My guest today on Podcast for Inquiry is Dr. Jonathan Stea. Jonathan is a full-time practicing clinical psychologist and an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Calgary. He's a two-time winner of the University of Calgary's Award for Excellence in Clinical Supervision. He was the 2022 recipient of the John G. Patterson Award from the Psychologists Association of Alberta, an annual award for the exceptional contribution to portraying psychological knowledge to the public. Today's episode focuses on Jonathan's book, Mind the Science: Saving Your Mental Health from the Wellness Industry. Our conversation revolves around the fact that many mental health practitioners have no scientific grounding for their treatments, which can lead to disaster. Yet, it can be very difficult for a layperson to distinguish between a new technique that they don't understand that works and a new technique that they don't understand that is gibberish. Quantum neurological reset therapy should set your spidey sense tingling, and Jonathan shares a few other signs of pseudoscientific grift as well. It is my pleasure to bring you my conversation with Dr. Jonathan Stea. Jonathan Stea, thank you for talking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
It's my absolute pleasure, Leslie. Thanks so much for having me.
I want to talk to you about the book that you wrote, the one that's called Mind the Science, Saving Your Mental Health from the Wellness Industry. And I find that that's sort of an interesting juxtaposition, because everything that the wellness industry promotes are things that I'm in favor of, like that good health is more than simply the absence of disease. In theory, the wellness industry takes the principle of, and we're both Canadian, but I'm still going to use the imperial metrics, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that you can do things to help your overall well-being, and that you should increase not only your lifespan, but also your health span. And I think all of that is great. So just very broadly speaking, why did you feel compelled to write a book that essentially claims that the purported goals of the wellness industry are not what they actually provide, or not the services that they provide to people that flock to it?
Yeah, and I agree with you in terms of prevention is very key, and lifestyle counseling is key to our health. Eating well, exercising well, nutrition, getting adequate sleep. These are fundamental aspects of all areas of health, including mental health. What the wellness industry does, and it has a very long history of doing this, is it tries to use that, and it's a lot of smoke and mirrors, because that's only part of its narrative. It tries to claim it as its own, and in doing so, it tries to sow distrust in mainstream medicine and in evidence-based healthcare, because what you're speaking about, prevention and exercise and eating well and sleeping well, those rightly fall under the purview of evidence-based medicine. I've been working full-time for over a decade in what's called a concurrent disorders clinic. So we help people who experience concurrent addiction and psychiatric disorders. So we do individual therapy and group therapy and pharmacological treatment. And I work with psychologists and social workers and nurses and occupational therapists. And for about once a week for over a decade, I've been running a group called essentially Self-Care, where we speak about those very things: nutrition, exercise, etc. And that's kind of foundational. What the wellness industry does, though, and this is one of its propaganda tactics, is it kind of uses this bait and switch to kind of use that to maybe get your foot in the door. But then what they're doing is they're essentially marketing pseudoscientific treatments and practices, and that are divorced from clinical guidelines and from the scientific literature. And so my beef with the wellness industry, so to speak, is that it sort of tries to claim prevention, or it tries to claim some of the evidence-based practices as their own, while simultaneously sowing distrust in evidence-based healthcare, and then commercializing our mental health and commercializing this idea of wellness to sell it back to us.
Okay, there's a lot there, and I want to focus on your area of expertise, which is the mind, and hence the name of your Mind the Science. So there's a certain amount, at least in the public perception, about where the state of science is, and I would like to baseline our knowledge of our knowledge of not how the brain works, like the neurology and so on, but how the mind works. So if you have cancer, we have some very effective diagnostic tools to know whether someone has cancer. We've got certain ways to address it, and then we can test whether or not it worked. And sometimes it does, often it does, and we're getting a lot better at it. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it comes back. There's people who have remission or a recurrence of their cancer. And if you go to an herbalist or a chiropractor who say that they can treat your cancer, whatever benefits these may do, it's not going to have any impact on it's not going to have any impact on the disease, on cancer. I think there's a general sense that we don't really understand the mind very well, despite all of the advances that we've made in understanding our brain. But that we don't really have a good grasp. How do we know whether someone's mind is functioning well? And so it seems it would be a lot easier for someone to have a non-scientifically backed treatment, because there isn't a good scientific understanding of the mind. Now, is that an accurate perception? Or what can you tell us, where is the state of knowledge about the mind at this point?
I would characterize that as accurate, and with the caveat that I don't think it's unique to the area of, say, psychiatry or clinical psychology or mental health. I think it does apply equally to things like cancer, which is sort of an umbrella term, and to other areas of health where we do have incomplete understandings of our health conditions. And in part, that's a huge reason why people do turn to alternative medicine, because there are huge gaps in our knowledge in all areas of health. But you are right, because it especially applies to the area of mental health and addiction, which is kind of where I work. We wish we had a complete scientific understanding of the nature of psychopathology and how to best provide evidence-based treatments. And the reality is that we have those gaps. That said, just because we have those gaps, first, it doesn't mean that we know nothing about the mind and that we don't know anything about it, and that we don't have evidence-based treatments that we know can help, compared to, say, treatments that are predicated or based on pseudoscientific components or don't have any evidentiary backing to support their use. So I'd say that's sort of an important issue. The other issue, I think, is that the solution to our gaps in knowledge, and this extends to gaps in our healthcare systems too, because even though we have an incomplete understanding of the mind, we also have gaps in our healthcare systems. Not everyone has access to the best available evidence-based treatments that we have. And so we have gaps in knowledge, we have gaps in healthcare. And so, yes, people turn to alternatives. But just because we have those gaps, I think rightfully that is a signal that we need better science, better access to evidence-based treatments, better transparency, cleaning up our own kind of house, so to speak. And it doesn't justify filling those gaps with financial and emotional exploitation under the guise of wellness or its various iterations like alternative medicine or functional medicine or integrative medicine, which are other kinds of branding or marketing terms that have been used to essentially sneak pseudoscience into healthcare.
So the Center for Inquiry Canada is very interested as an organization in mental health. We have a mental health chair. We participate in Mental Health Mondays. That's someone else within the organization that takes care of it. I'm very new to the area. But let's say I or someone I know is having a mental health crisis or having issues, and they realize that they need some help. There's a huge range of people that one can go to, and some of these are names that you can trust or that have some kind of certification from a medical authority, and some are just someone hangs out a shingle, and I don't actually know what all of them are. So, for example, I do know that a psychiatrist is an actual medical doctor who specializes in mental health, and only someone who has an MD with that specialization can call themselves a psychiatrist. We also have counselors out there, and if I wanted to today, I could hang my shingle outside my door and open up a counseling practice, and maybe I'm good at it and maybe I'm not, but I don't have any formal training. I'm just relying on my intuitive sense to, and empathic abilities to help people. So those are two that I know, right? Like someone who calls themselves a counselor, maybe they're good, maybe they're bad, but it's got caveat emptor. You have to trust the person. If someone's a psychiatrist, if nothing else, you've got the backing of the medical establishment. But there's psychologists, therapists, social workers, psychoanalysts, psychotherapists, coach, and more. Is psychiatrist the only reserved term, and can anyone call themselves anything else, or are there other things that you can trust that someone has some education and a grounding of knowledge before you go see them?
It's such an important question, and one of which, it was one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, is to try to help people just attend to this issue, because like you said, it's very much caveat emptor, buyer beware in the world of mental health. There are many bona fide sources of mental health professionals, say. So mental health professionals could be an umbrella term, meaning they have training and expertise in the treatment of mental health concerns, and that will vary based on discipline, and it will vary based on training and what's called regulatory bodies. So I'll kind of back up. So a psychiatrist, you're right, has an MD, and they have a licensing body, a regulatory body that helps protect the public. Similarly, clinical psychologists, which is what I am, the majority have a PhD. Some in Canada with different provinces like Alberta, you can also practice with a master's degree. Still, we're obligated by the College of Alberta Psychologists. So we have a licensing body that has a code of ethics and a legal standards of practice to try to help the public to make sure that we're practicing competently and ethically.
So if I was in Alberta, I couldn't just say, hi, I'm Leslie Rosenblood and I'm a clinical psychologist. I'd have to actually be certified by the College of Psychologists of Alberta?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so legally protected titles have a college associated with them. So you can't call yourself a psychiatrist, you can't call yourself a social worker or a nurse or a psychologist. You can call yourself a mental health clinician or a counselor or a wellness coach or a wellness consultant, because there are no regulatory bodies there to govern that practice. It's literally nothing. My mom or my friend or you or anyone can just kind of hang a shingle, like you said, or set up an Instagram page and claim that they're able to offer mental health services under that guise. And in doing so, it's very dangerous because, again, a regulatory body's purpose is to help protect the public, but it's also to ensure that, its practitioners that they govern abide by codes of ethics and legal standards of practice. And so a counselor that just randomly sets up an Instagram page with they have no legal liability, they have no codes of ethics, and they have no legal standards of practice. And so that's a scary thing when someone says that they're able to treat your anxiety disorder or your depression or your post-traumatic stress disorder or your opioid addiction.
Right. And so in one of the cases, you highlight an example in your book of somebody going to an unregulated, it was a retreat in the example that, and you talk about Kirby Brown, and you talk about her, and at the beginning of this retreat, I'm just going to quote something that you write. If they were serious about their personal growth, then they needed to invest in themselves to expect pain and discomfort by partaking in a slew of physically and emotionally demanding activities. And you tell the full story, and it ends tragically, and people can read about this in more detail in the book. What I want to focus on is that bit that I just quoted. You have to, essentially the no pain, no gain. You can only get out what you put in. That sounds like every doctor, every coach, everybody that I have ever heard talk about self-improvement or getting better. If you want to get better, you have to follow the course of treatment. You have to take the full course of antibiotics, even after you feel better. You want to be able to increase how far you run or how much weight you can lift. You've got to put in the effort, and you're going to feel discomfort as you get stronger. So how do you distinguish the caregivers who are going to make you experience physical or emotional discomfort in order to make you feel better, in order to get stronger, from the charlatans who are simply exploiting you and using your discomfort or your pain as an excuse for their own negligence?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's it's compelling, right? Because grifters, so to speak, or people are charlatans or people that are trying to sell us mental health services without any training or background. I think a lot of them, the vast majority, are actually well-intentioned. Like, I don't think that the vast majority are out to, maliciously dupe people. I think there's a subset of those folks, but the majority are well-meaning. That said, good intentions, doesn't really necessarily translate to improved health outcomes, and that doesn't mean that someone's actual mental health will improve. And I think what is especially difficult for people to navigate is that when you get a guru or a grifter or someone like James Arthur Ray, who I mentioned in the book, who you were alluding to, says something like no pain, no gain. I mean, a lot of what these gurus might say are compelling and attractive, and maybe two of the things that they say are fantastic, but then three of the things that they say are completely pseudoscientific and can potentially be harmful. And again, without that credentials and protection with a regulatory body, that a patient has no recourse when things go awry. And so, yeah, I guess back to your question of how do you navigate that? That was one of the aims of my book, was to try to help people learn what to look for. How do you evaluate good credentials? How do you know what to even seek when you're seeking mental health concerns? Because often when people say even present to our clinic, it's very quote unquote normal to not understand what the issues are. And in part, that's kind of the training of a mental health professional, is to help people sort that through and explore their thoughts and feelings. And maybe there's a diagnosis there. But when you don't have any of that, like someone coming to treatment, it's just very overwhelming when people are very emotionally distressed. And so any kind of relief is super compelling. And if you get a charismatic guy, a charismatic guru like James Arthur Ray, they suck people in, and they can suck them dry and kind of emotionally as well. Incidentally, I did write about James Arthur Ray in the book, and he passed away, I think it was last week or a week before that. So that's take that as it is. I think it's tragic, but it's also tragic that he was continuing to offer kind of those services as well.
Indeed. Let me give you two caricatures of your area of specialization. And I say this not because I think that they're accurate, because I want you to tell me why and how they are wrong. So the first one is the Freudian psychology, where if you're not feeling quite yourself, you go to a psychologist, you lie down on a couch, and you talk about your childhood and especially your relationship with your mother. And the second caricature is that I would never go to a psychologist. They're just people that are so messed up. They studied it so they could try and fix themselves. And so I'd like you to tell me why and how these two caricatures are wrong, and paint for me a more accurate picture of your profession and the professionals that staff it.
Sure. I love those examples. The Freudian one first. When people, this is part, I think, a problem with the psychology teaching. People have, different interpretations of Freud. If they've taken a psychology 100 class in university, they've heard of the id, the ego, and the superego. And basically a lot of what pop culture knows about Freud is sort of back in the horse and buggy era. So we don't practice from that. I don't have a couch in our clinic or in our office. And so no one's lying down and kind of necessarily talking about the relationship with their mother. Freud was practicing something called psychoanalysis, which has been used as an example of a textbook pseudoscience. That's sort of the bad of the Freudian aspect. The good is that, there's been a lot of evolution in what's called psychoanalytic thought over decades. And so psychodynamic therapy is actually a sort of a branch or an offshoot of psychoanalysis that actually has a lot of evidence behind it. And it's actually considered an evidence-based treatment for a myriad of mental health concerns. So, and then kind of back to the question of, just talking with your mother, again, it kind of comes down to a case formulation. So, for example, if someone comes to see me and they don't, they're presenting with addiction and mental health concerns, a bona fide mental health professional will first conduct a psychological assessment. We will ask a person about all areas of their life, get their psychological history, get their social history, and try to tease out and develop what's called a case formulation to try to figure out what are the problems that the person's experiencing, and they may or may not fall into a category of a mental health diagnosis or not. And sometimes those problems that people are experiencing will stem from very difficult relationships, whether it's with their mother or their spouse or their child, and maybe they've developed post-traumatic stress disorder because they've had a really traumatic upbringing where they had a history of physical, sexual, emotional abuse from their parents. In those contexts, we probably will be talking about their relationship with their mother in therapy. But for other people, even with people with addiction, they might have had a fantastic childhood and upbringing, and we don't need to talk about their mother at all whatsoever. And so that's sort of the nuance that kind of comes out of that. The other aspect of your question was, yes, all mental health professionals are ill in some way or have mental health concerns of their own. To that, I might just say, well, number one, we don't necessarily know that. Number two, even if they did, I think it's important to destigmatize mental health and mental illness concerns, because just because, and we do, there's going to be mental health professionals who do have mental health concerns, and there'll be ones that don't. And it's important to destigmatize that idea that, it's important to talk about all of these things, and it doesn't necessarily translate to poor quality care if the person who is providing that treatment has their mental health concerns well managed and they're stabilized. Obviously, if they're kind of decompensating and they're not doing well and they're in the midst of a depressive episode, or they have an anxiety disorder that's debilitating and impacting their work, or an addiction, that's something that they shouldn't be treating people at that time. and regulatory bodies will actually ask about those things. But for the most part, I would say that that's often, and I'm not saying you're saying that because it's a trope that I hear, but that's a stigmatizing, I think, idea that tries to dismiss the notion that a psychologist or a mental health professional can actually help people.
All right, thank you. You wrote an excellent summary of what scientific literacy means, and you broke it down into 3 parts. If you don't mind, I'm just going to quote from you about that, and then what I'd like you to do is to apply this to the science of the mind. And so you have to do 3 things in order to be scientifically literate. One is possess knowledge about the basic facts, concepts in the vocabulary. So you can actually understand what someone is saying when talking about a scientific subject, which is what I kind of stopped there when I thought of scientific literacy. You just have to understand the way of the universe and how things work. But you expand that to saying understanding scientific practices, such as concepts related to hypothesis testing, probability, and correlation versus causation. And then the third one is understand science as a social process, such as the role of peer review, the accumulation of accepted findings, and the nature of funding and conflicts of interest. So I thought that was really interesting. So talk about basically all 3 of these things, because I like it, but you really expanded my definition. I stopped at just, you're scientifically literate if you understand that, there's the speed of light and then gravity and Newton's laws and Einstein's modification and so on. And then, okay, now as far as physics is concerned, you have a basic scientific literacy, but it's much more than that. So can you expand on why these other aspects of things are just as important to be considered scientifically literate, and then apply that to our understanding of the mind, please?
Totally, it's an important question too. I love that conceptualization of scientific literacy. I think it offers a more complete understanding of the scientific enterprise. I mean, as we know, science is an evolving process, and it's more than just a body of accumulated facts, which can and do kind of change over time. And the other aspects are super important because science changes in its methodology and its methods, and there's so many different ways to conduct and to do science that will vary across disciplines, right? So we would say randomized controlled trials, and in medicine and in psychology, versus other areas of science like chemistry are using different kind of scientific methods, or physics. So it's important to understand that that's part of the process. And then the third one is that, science is very much a social process, and that's crucial to know, because that kind of plays into the idea of how sometimes misinformation can spread and kind of propaganda. Humans are incredibly fallible, and that can be built into what we call science. The idea is that we want to try to protect against that. Science is supposed to, we like to think of it as this very cold, dry, clinical application, but the reality, to think of it in that way, just belies reality. That's not how it is. I mean, humans conduct science. We have research grants. We have application processes. It's influenced by politics and policy. Look what's happening in the US with RFK Jr. Like, that's going to blow the landscape completely away in terms of what gets funded, what doesn't get funded. And so that stuff is super important to understand when trying to navigate the world of mental health, and to try to decide what is an evidence-based treatment or not. And so in the book, I give an example of, to try to answer your question of applying it to the mind, say, of how to use science literacy skills. I found this treatment called quantum neurological reset therapy, which is developed by a chiropractor named Dr. Turner. And so, it purports to be able to, use quantum physics to change the neurocellular devices in your mind that are going to transmute frequencies across a wide range of a vibration. So whatever I just said is complete gobbledygook. Like it's nothing. It's sort of sciencey sounding language, which happens to be a pseudoscientific warning sign. But I think that when people can learn about science literacy skills themselves, they'll be able to understand something like, quantum physics applied to the mind as a treatment. They should have their spidey senses up, saying, because anyone that has just a very, very basic understanding of quantum physics, I know nothing about it, but I know that it's so complicated that an alternative medicine practitioner doesn't understand how to use that to treat your post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, I remember there was an interview with Einstein that said that only two, and the interviewer asked, is it really true that only two people in the world understand quantum mechanics? And he looked at the reporter and said, who's the other one?
Exactly. And I think Richard Feynman said, if you think you understand quantum mechanics, then you don't.
Right. And you use the spidey sense, and that I'm a lifelong geek, but I noticed that there's a trend in comic books, but in science fiction more generally, which is that something that is new and in technical circles established technology, but not widely understood, becomes the vehicle for science fiction extrapolation of stories. So you'll write back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where electricity was clearly a thing, but people didn't understand how it works. And so it was electricity that reanimated a corpse, and that's how Frankenstein's monster was created. And if you go back to like the 50s or the 60s, radiation was very common and was well understood on a scientific level, but not well understood on by the public. So it's a irradiated spider that bit Peter Parker, and that's how he became Spider-Man. And then you go forward to like the 70s and early 80s, and that was genetics, right? So that all the superheroes were just mutants because of genetic anomaly, and now they can fly or shoot laser beams from their eyes or whatever. And today, it's quantum. Like anything, and you put quantum in front of anything, and you get quantum neuro reset therapy being used by something. And also, you get movies called Quantum Mania in the quantum realm and such. So that always happens. How do you prevent, or how can you as an individual take something that you don't understand? You don't understand quantum mechanics. I make no pretensions that I can understand quantum mechanics, but it's real. I'm not saying that I don't think that quantum mechanics is all a fraud. So, given that I'm not an expert, I'm probably not going to develop that expertise. When someone dons the mantle of authority and says, "I know this thing, you don't know this thing that I do." And here's how it can work to help you. How can I tell whether that person is actually speaking from a solid foundation of knowledge and understanding, or whether they are simply woo-woo and making it up and throwing out this vocabulary that doesn't actually make sense to someone who actually is an expert?
Yeah, it's incredibly dangerous when that happens, right? And so what you're alluding to is, I read in the research literature, they call it the Einstein effect, which is basically the idea that people are more likely to believe claims when it's coming from, say, a doctor or a scientific authority than just a random guru with no credentials. So in our example of quantum neuro reset therapy, it's bought from Dr. Turner. And so, people are some people will fall victim to that kind of ploy. And I don't like that. And so, you're asking the question, well, how do people protect against that? In part, I think it's that science literacy aspect that comes into it, knowing that something like quantum mechanics is super complicated and probably no one should be talking about it except experts in quantum physics or physicists and not chiropractors or, alternative medicine practitioners that try to merge that with the area of mental health where they say they can actually address someone's trauma and their PTSD. So I think that's part of the science literacy skill aspect to it. I also want, one of the big messages of my book was trying to outline a variety of pseudoscientific warning signs. So I give a list or an example, say 9 of them. And I think that's really at the individual level what people can do. It's trying to learn the language, say, of pseudoscientific grift and learn the language of wellness. So I try to give examples of or lists various pseudoscientific warning signs and alternative medicine tropes. And I think that when people can become well acquainted with those, they can then go to, say, a website, Google any alternative medicine clinic and try to find these pseudoscientific warning signs, and that should be getting the spidey senses up. And that then is a call to be super, super skeptical about the claims made.
So we'll come back to those nine signs, because I think that's important, and I want to talk about that. But I want to, before we get there, I want to come back to this theme of distinguishing between something that sounds like it's plausible and false. Like, how you distinguish something that sounds plausible, and it's plausible because it's true, it's an accurate description, and something that sounds plausible, but that isn't actually true. So you write early on in your book, rejecting the scientific consensus is a pretty good indicator of poor science literacy. And I can understand that if you want to throw out all of chemistry, or you want to throw out biology, or you're violating the law of physics, probably means that your product isn't going to do the thing that they claim it's going to do. But that stuck out for me, because I can see that I can see that being taken too far, because that's if held dogmatically, that would be a recipe for stagnation. Today's dogmas are yesterday's heresies. You mentioned the Einstein effect. Well, Einstein, famously said, well, Newton was kind of mostly right, but he was wrong, right? If you go really, really fast, Newton's laws don't apply anymore, and here are other laws, and it was a wild, crazy idea that completely went in violation of the scientific consensus at the time. I remember seeing another interview where there was a book published about something like 100 scientists explain why Einstein's relativity is wrong, and Einstein's response was, "Why 100? If relativity wasn't true, one should be enough." And there's probably some wild ideas today, most of which are garbage because they're wild, but there'll be common sense in 10 years, some of them. So how do we distinguish between that's so crazy you might just be right, and that's just crazy?
It's hard, and I tried to be delicate in my book with that idea, because I agree with you, right? I mean, the very nature of science is an evolving process. Consensus changes over time. That said, I think the way forward is to balance scientific consensus with skepticism and intellectual humility, because what we're seeing in our culture right now is completely throwing out the scientific consensus and this kind of contrarianism, which is actually infiltrating our institutions and our healthcare systems. And that is why I wanted to really highlight that. So, for example, we're getting people like RFK Jr., who is a big leader in the US healthcare system now, who will flagrantly claim things that are completely divorced from the scientific literature. Things like vaccines cause autism. The scientific consensus is that they don't. Or that HIV doesn't cause AIDS. Like, things that are really, really unequivocally wrong, and not just wrong because, and people really mistake the idea of a scientific consensus, because I see this on social media all the time. They think it's just a bunch of dudes or a bunch of people gathering around a table and voting, and that's your consensus, when really, no, a scientific consensus is more, that's a byproduct. It's really about converging evidence developed from across a mass array of scientific studies that all agree with and support each other. That's kind of the scientific consensus, where you have that kind of overwhelming mountain of evidence. Yes, that can shift over time, but it does take a lot to do that. And what we see in the wellness industry, and again, kind of in alternative medicine and in anti-science movements like the anti-vaccine movement and the anti-psychiatry movement, is that they throw out the scientific consensus and then pitch their own ideas, and they commercialize them and they sell them as the truth while sowing distrust in mainstream medicine and consensus. And I think that's very dangerous. So yes, the grounded skeptic should be always wary of the scientific consensus and yet not completely throwing it out, which is, I think, what we see in alternative medicine. You get people promoting homeopathy, which says that water can remember molecules, or that, that a remedy is more effective when the active ingredient is literally diluted out of existence. So that violates fundamental principles of pharmacology. Or things like energy healing, where you can treat your depression or your post-traumatic stress disorder by having a practitioner hover their hands over your body without touching you to manipulate or unbalance your energy blockages. So those are extreme cases. And at the same time, those are lucrative industries, and people are literally selling you that kind of stuff. And so that's why I really wanted to make the case that the scientific consensus is important. It's not the be-all, end-all, and we do need to be skeptical and intellectually humble. And I think that I think what we've seen in the COVID era and where we are now is this contrarianism, which is sort of a hostility to scientific consensus, which is harmful.
Yeah, and I've spoken with other guests about the effect of the indirect effect of the COVID pandemic, of how attitudes on vaccines became political and identitarian. Like, I since I identify with this political party and my political party is skeptic, therefore I'm dubious. And then it wasn't a medical decision. It was almost a personal one. I'd like to focus on a particular alt med therapy because I think the story is compelling, and I learned something about it in your book. But I want to set the stage. So I'm going to ask a few questions. Can you start by telling me what therapeutic touch is? What's therapeutic touch?
It's a branch or it's a subset of an umbrella term called energy healing or energy medicine, which has its roots in a philosophy called vitalism, which is this idea that we do have this magical kind of energy force flowing through our bodies. And so therapeutic touch, weirdly enough, doesn't involve any touch. It's sort of, like I mentioned, it's similar to other kinds of energy healing modalities like Reiki, where a practitioner would hover their hands around someone's body. And the idea is that you're trying to use the body's vitalistic force or their magical energy force that's kind of flowing through them, and to try to unblock their blockages, and then that will somehow treat their mental health concerns, whether it's their depression. And of course, this idea is completely divorced from the broader scientific literature.
So I remember reading about 15 years ago, there was an experiment done by, if memory serves, it was a 10-year-old girl.
Emily Rosa.
Yes. So can you describe, so now that we know basically what therapeutic touch is, can you describe what Emily did to demonstrate the efficacy of therapeutic touch and whether that experiment passed or failed?
I wish I remembered all of the details of that experiment, because I've read it 20 times and I still can't remember it all completely. But basically what she did is she brought some therapeutic touch practitioners into the room, and she tested one of the fundamental ideas, which is that they'd be able to sense her energy flow. And at the end of the day, they didn't perform any better than chance and actually performed worse.
Okay, so this I knew. I read about that experiment, and I thought that was I thought it was brilliant because it was simple and it demonstrated that. What I learned from reading your book is, and this is a quotation, therapeutic touch appears in the current North American Nursing Diagnosis Association manual. And this is a treatment that, as you say, was debunked a decade and a half ago. So I was shocked to learn that. I mean, you mentioned when we first started talking, a nurse is a protected term. You cannot call yourself a nurse without getting a formal education that's regulated by the government and the college. But the official North American nursing diagnosis manual has therapeutic touch, a completely debunked, known to be false treatment regimen. So that leaves me with two questions. One, is therapeutic touch, given the dignity of being real? I mean, that invests it as that with the very strong implication that there is something valid to therapeutic touch. And so who else is endorsing it, explicitly or implicitly? And secondly, what else in the nursing diagnosis manual and the DSM and in your own profession is present that contains known falsehoods or things that we know to be true, things that we know to be true that are said to be false, or things that we know to be false that are said to be true?
Yeah, it's highly concerning. Highly concerning. I don't know why it's still in there. And you're right. And I think it speaks to, again, back to the construct of science literacy as science being a social process, and how things can get put into, say, clinical guidelines or even endorsed by entire scientific professions that are predicated on pseudoscience. I think that's much more in the gray zone and kind of dangerous to the public, and it's alarming. And it also kind of goes back to the idea, we discussed how it's important to have regulatory bodies and have licensing, to have licenses. At the same time, related to that, there are actually bona fide pseudoscientific professions that have regulatory bodies and that are licensed too. And so they've sort of been enshrined to almost be credible. So for example, I mentioned homeopathy, how homeopathy, like therapeutic touch, is an unequivocal pseudoscientific treatment. It literally cannot work because it's the idea that you have no active ingredient in a remedy. So it's literally impossible. It can't work. And yet, in Ontario, which I believe is the only province in Canada, a homeopath is a protected title. So there's a regulatory body for homeopathy in Ontario. So I can't call myself a homeopath in Ontario. I can do it in Alberta. And that's alarming because, again, it sort of adds that air of legitimacy. And then to your point, how do pseudoscientific treatments even become legitimized within bona fide health professions like psychiatry and nursing and social work? And I wish I had a good answer to that, other than that's why, in part, I'm trying to help motivate people to learn how to spot pseudoscientific grift and to protect themselves, because I don't think any area of health is immune to the perils of pseudoscience.
So I want to stay with homeopathy for a moment because, again, this is a quandary that I always struggle with. So we can take the position that homeopathy is a fraud. It's false. It cannot work. It makes no sense, even in principle. I mean, Paracelsus back in the early 17th century said the dose makes the poison. Homeopathy throws that out the window. And so we have to conclude then that Ontario's regulatory system, by creating a college and making it a protected name and thereby investing homeopathy with, and the implicit endorsement of Ontario's healthcare infrastructure, made a terrible mistake and was corrupted somehow. Or we can say, look, Ontario is the most populous province of the country. It's got the deepest and most established healthcare regime. It did its due diligence, and there have been haters like you, Mr. Stea, that have dismissed this for decades, if not a century or more. But finally, the truth is coming out. Homeopathy works. It is effective. Not for everything, but for certain things, which is why, alongside the German government and other places around the world, Ontario is finally allowing this long derided treatment and improving the health of Ontarians. And you ask us to trust the scientific consensus, and here we've got really about as strong an endorsement as you get from the Ontario government. So, how would you decide which of those two perspectives is accurate, given that there is a college of homeopaths in the province of Ontario?
I think it reflects that's sort of the balance between where do you trust expertise and where do you trust your science literacy skills, right? And there is no easy answer to this. These are very nuanced topics. And so if someone has enough science literacy skills to understand that homeopathy literally can't work, then they should probably go with that and conclude instead that the other provinces are correct, or that the very body in the U.S. dedicated to investigating alternative medicine has concluded that homeopathy literally doesn't work for anything. And so, but to your point, it's sort of, where do we draw the line between, again, it kind of comes back to the idea of trusting expertise versus using your own kind of pseudoscientific grift detectors or science literacy skills. And I don't know, it's not a cookie cutter approach. It's a delicate dance.
All right. I got one more question, and then I want to come to the 9 warning signs of pseudoscientific grift. And that was something you wrote something else that quite surprised me, and so I'd like you to expand on it, because I found this quite counterintuitive. And you write, and again, this is a quotation, that newer research is starting to show that mindfulness can cause harm. It leads to increases in anxiety, depression, disorientation, confusion, attention memory problems, perceptual hypersensitivity, stress, and hallucinations. So that's that's quite the list. Now, I find that counterintuitive because speaking as an amateur, not an expert, mindfulness makes intuitive sense to me. Taking a deep breath, being aware of your surroundings, being aware of your reactions to stimuli. You've had a hard day at work. Well, why is it getting to you today more than other days? Something happened in your life. How are you going to react to that? Taking a step and realizing, okay, this bad thing happened, but this bad thing happened in a sea of good things, and being mindful and aware of that tends to bring, so I would think that the dominant effect of mindfulness would be less stress, more calm, better perspective. And then when you have that as your grounding, that leads to better decision making. And with better decision making comes a better life. You'll note that none of that included anxiety, depression, disorientation, and so on. So can you expand on how mindfulness, which sounds good, makes intuitive sense, can actually lead to all of these quite detrimental effects?
Yeah. And, I discussed mindfulness in the book. Well, number one, because it's so incredibly popular. And I tried to present sort of, again, the nuanced or the reality of its status, say, in evidence-based healthcare. And so in the wellness world, so to speak, we get people who are pitching it as a panacea, which is sort of one of those pseudoscientific warning signs. So it can help with everything: mental health, cancer, glaucoma, COVID-19, whatever it is, right? So pitching it as a panacea is sort of one of the pseudoscientific warning signs. The reality of mindfulness, when you go to the literature, is that it's a huge area of research. We offer it in our own clinic. We have a mindfulness group. I've been doing mindfulness exercises, again, with people with concurrent addiction and mental health concerns for years. And that's in part because there are particular protocols that have been studied that use mindfulness in their treatment packages that have been found to be really helpful. So things like Alan Marlat's relapse prevention model for addiction. We have things like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. We have dialectical behavior therapy, which is an evidence-based treatment, and mindfulness is a component of that, which can help people with particular mental health concerns. Like borderline personality disorder and other just kind of emotion regulation difficulties. What the body of research has also discovered, though, is that the quote that you were reading is that for a subsample or subset of people, it actually can exacerbate or make worse mental health symptoms. And so that's a call again to the science to try to figure out, who does mindfulness work for and who doesn't it work for. Anecdotally, which happens to be, in my clinical experience, it helps a lot of my patients, and for some it makes it worse. Anecdotally, and it's hard to pin that down, and that's what we need science to kind of to help figure out. Just to kind of satisfy your question, I think that because if you're puzzled by that, it tends to be, again, in my clinical experience, it tends to be some of the folks with anxiety disorders who are hyper attuned to their own body sensations, and then that tends to trigger, say, a panic attack or an anxiety attack. Panic attack's the proper term. And so sometimes mindfulness can help kind of slow down the process and to kind of breathe through it. But for other people, if you help them focus more on their heart rate and on their, rapid breathing, for some people, for whatever reason, it just sensitizes them and exacerbates the problem. That's one example in which it could be harmful.
Okay, so it is actually a very useful technique for a large number of people, but it's not a universal. It's not a universal one, and for some individuals, it can lead to worse outcomes.
Exactly, and that's what evidence-based healthcare is. It's trying to figure out who and under what circumstances do our evidence-based treatments work for. What are the risks and what are the benefits? And it's trying to figure out how do we tailor approaches. We're not good at that. That's where the science is behind, like you said. But the wellness approach is to pitch it for everyone, and that's what I'm trying to caution against.
So a lot of what we've talked about today, and a good part of your book, is trying to distinguish between what sounds good and what actually works, because what actually works often does sound good as well. So you list and you mentioned the 9 warning signs of pseudoscientific grift. So I'm going to turn it over to you and say, okay, help our readers. Can you identify what those 9 warning signs are? Your book will get into far more detail, but at least at a high level, give people the highlights of what should set their spidey sense off there, or put the hair on the back of their necks on to stand up straight if they see one or more of these.
Totally. And yeah, it's hard. I've been trying to do this in a very concise way, and I don't think I can, so I'm just going to highlight a couple of them rather than all 9. But I think one of the important ones for me, or at least they're all important, but some of the really striking ones would be elevation of anecdotal evidence is one of them. So what that means is having wellness claims or treatments that are marketed and sold using testimonials or anecdotal evidence. So again, quantum neurological reset therapy worked for Bob and Karen, etc. And so therefore it works. Well, we know that we need higher quality evidence than anecdotal evidence to support and recommend a treatment. But that's not what you get, say, in the wellness industry. So the warning sign is if you go onto a website and you see testimonials splattered all over that website saying this treatment works, that's a warning sign. And incidentally, that's actually unethical for psychologists to use. If I set up a private practice, I'm not allowed to put patient testimonials and saying that my treatments work on there, because our ethics acknowledge that inherent kind of, number one, it's a power imbalance, but 2, it's inaccurate advertising, because Well, it just is based on anecdotal evidence, and it capitalizes on this logical fallacy that we're all susceptible to, which is the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, which basically means just because something comes before and then something comes after doesn't mean that there's a causal connection between those things. So just because you shower every morning and the sun rises doesn't mean that your shower caused the sun to rise. That's the inherent flaw in anecdotal evidence. So that's one warning sign. Beware of testimonials and anecdotal evidence. The other one I would say is that one of the biggest ones, which we kind of talked about, but it's super important and it separates the wheat from the chaff, is this idea of claims that are divorced from the broader scientific literature. So again, meaning things like homeopathy, if water, you're looking for claims that don't make any sense compared to, again, kind of the scientific consensus. So water can't remember molecules. Your energy blockages can't be manipulated by someone not touching you with their hands hovering over you. So things like that are a huge warning sign, that especially if it's a treatment for a health condition. So any kind of claims that are divorced like that. So energy healing has claims divorced from the broader scientific literature. Homeopathy does as well. So that's what I would kind of watch for. Again, quantum neurological reset therapy is another one, and that kind of piggybacks on another kind of pseudoscientific warning sign, which is that sciencey sounding language. And I understand that takes a degree of science literacy skills to be able to recognize when scientific sounding terminology is being misused, but that is a hallmark of pseudoscience. Another one, maybe a last one that I'll say is two kind of related ones. One is the evasion of peer review. So if you're hearing all of your support for for the practitioner's treatments coming from blogs and websites and articles and even books that are sort of evade the scientific literature, that's a warning sign, because pseudoscientific promoters will kind of evade that whole peer review process. More insidiously, I would say, and this is a harder one for people to pick up on because it does require a degree of science literacy skills, is that we want to beware of pseudoscientific journals themselves, because that's an entire industry. And it's a dangerous one because grifters can use findings derived from pseudoscientific journals to support their treatments. So for example, you can find journals out there like the Journal of, say, Evidence-Based Integrative Medicine, or Explore is another one, where in the journal Explore, they'll publish studies that say, like a randomized controlled trial, that if you send positive vibes to water, you can make its ice crystals look more beautiful. Like just absurd claims like that. and they look legit. There's an introduction, there's a method section, there's a results section. And so that can really be deceptive for a layperson that doesn't really have those skills. Or there's another journal that actually entertained the idea, or a study in a pseudoscientific journal that entertained the idea that demonic possession was a ideological factor or a causal factor in schizophrenia, or an explanation for schizophrenia. And that's absurd. But again, it has an introduction, and it's on PubMed, which is a repository of journals. And so that's an insidious kind of thing too. But maybe I'll kind of leave it there for today.
Well, okay, that there are more signs and of pseudoscience, and to read all of them, read Jonathan Stea's Mind the Science. Jonathan, I'm going to link to your webpage and to your social media feeds in the show notes, so anyone who wants more can click on those links and follow you online. Do you have any last thoughts for our audience today?
Not really. I mean, I would just encourage people. I think a big theme of our discussion was to be skeptical and not cynical, and to try to find that delicate dance, and just to keep your spidey senses up, because misinformation and pseudoscience is not a trivial game. It can influence our health decisions and the decisions of those we love. And so it's an important thing to be mindful of. And I'd leave it there. And Leslie, thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Jonathan Stea. If you enjoyed today's podcast, Please consider giving us a 5-star review and showing your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry. Email us podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web, on Facebook, and you can follow us on Blue Sky at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblatt. See you next time.